I would like to thank you all for being here very early, kind of, and despite whatever is happening on the trains today. I, of course, want to thank to our participants. We can only imagine how busy they are, but they accepted to join us today, and I'm pretty sure that they will help us become more enlightened and less confused people at the end of the day. And let me briefly mention why we wanted to organize this panel workshop. We don't really know what to call it exactly. So recently, interdisciplinarity has started to gain value, although the traditional disciplines still dominate academia. But we think our disciplines aren't the only thing that limit us. We are also limited by our subfields, even the turfs within our subfields. So although the barriers are set in stone, there's no know-how as to how to cross them or how to overcome them. So we thought, why try to invent the wheel again and again, and why try to find our ways in the dark rather than asking to people who actually did it in a pretty awesome way. So we decided to invite our participants, and also we all have to write a methodology section in our dissertations, and we need all the advice we can get from people who know how to do it, because at the end of the day, I'm a theorist, I assume many people here are theorists, and if you're a theorist, do you have a method? We don't know, or do you have an approach? If you do have a method, how do you harmonize your findings in the field with like broader theoretical questions? What if you are using theories from multiple disciplines? So these questions, I think, may end up in never-ending PhDs. We wanted to ask these questions to our participants, and I think we're going to have some answers or questions to our questions today. But we also know that like one event will not cure all the problems about the confusion about theory and method. So we are organizing a second one in the spring. It is SPITZA's annual student conference. It's called this year Method ? So please submit your abstracts by February 1. You can find, let me show you. You can find the call for papers there on the table. Also, please sign our sheet. Thank you.
So I guess we'll go ahead and get started. The way we've organized this, we've asked each of the speakers to talk for about 20 minutes about what they do, and then there will be breakout sessions in various rooms across the campus for you to ask more personalized questions about your work, about methods, and get sort of specialized advice depending on your field and area of research. We're just going to go by the order of the program, and I'll introduce each person before they speak so that you're not just listening to me talk for a long period of time. Up first, we have Professor Banu Barhu. She is the Associate Professor of Politics at the New School for Social Research. Her work is situated at the intersection of philosophy, politics, history, and political anthropology, with a regional emphasis on the Middle East and especially Turkish politics. She uses continental and critical theory, as well as history of Western political thought, and uses these theoretical insights to comment on politics and resistance practices and contemporary problems. She's the author of Starve and Immolate, The Politics of Human Weapons, which received APSA's first book prize. And she has been published in numerous journals, and we are very happy to welcome her here today.
Thank you. I don't know if I can promise enlightenment. I'll do my best. It's not frequently the case that I get invited to give a talk on methods. As political theorists, this is not something that we're very good at. Our method is primarily reading. But I want to make a case for theory in two senses of the word today. One, as making a case for theory, making an argument, making a pitch for political and especially critical theory, despite the general trend of its marginalization, and both in terms of the quantitative sort of dominance in the discipline of political science, but also because of some of the paths that critical theorists have taken in the last 2-3 decades that I think has contributed to that marginalization. And secondly, I want to discuss the idea of a case for theory in the sense of as a use of a method, of a form, of a genre, or instance that allows us to explore, illuminate, think through problems, issues, concepts theoretically. So I have in mind the method of a case study, or understanding something as a case of something else. And here I want to resist the temptation of reading Rousseau as a case of democratic theory, but really talk about doing field work and empirical research for political theorists. So I just want to begin with the second one, since that's more concrete, and then work my way backwards to the more general case for political theory that I want to make. And the question sort of that I want to raise is, why or do we need cases for political theory? And if we do, why do we do it? Why do we need it? And do we need to experiment with methods, qualitative forms of inquiry, or should we just stick to theory, which is often what is deemed appropriate? So political theorists work with texts, and that's been the general sort of dominant approach. But 20th century political theory has expanded the notion of text to include speeches, news, visuals, but also social practices, movements, acts of resistance, and to look at these as texts. But oftentimes, field work and different modalities of qualitative inquiry, such as ethnography, interviews, archival work, oral history, these have been relegated to other subfields in political science, especially comparative politics, and other disciplines, sort of history, anthropology, cultural studies. And perhaps it's too early to announce sort of an ethnographic turn in political theory, but I do want to say that I think in contemporary thinkers there's much more of a willingness to experiment and engage. Now, part of this obviously is the realization, maybe finally, that the canon is actually a dead white European man's tradition, and its uncritical and reified study perpetuates a certain optic that privileges a male Western subjectivity and power relations. So, I mean, obviously Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, they constitute a venerable tradition of knowledge, or maybe one can even speak of it in the plural, as knowledge is, considering the different voices, approaches, perspectives within the tradition. But privileging these texts also means that political theory is circumscribed greatly. It can't access what Foucault would call subjugated and disqualified knowledges. Precisely those discursive practices that are excluded, marginalized by actors who are considered to lack the epistemic standing to have their discourse count as texts of political theory. in order to sort of access women's voices, the voices of the poor, the non-Western, the enslaved peoples. I mean, these are only present in the canon, in the ellipses, or in the presuppositions as almost caricaturized counterpoints. So the noble savage, the Orient, in the beginning all the world was America. So if we want to attend to these subaltern knowledges, if we want to attend to these marginal knowledges, we need to be willing to go to different texts. And I think 20th century political theory has tried to do this. Historically, to treat the religious texts of the Puritans, for example, rather than just take Hobbes. This has been an important move. Utopian novels, the fiery speeches of the suffragettes, I mean, all of these have been explored. And more recently, I think, looking at political practices as texts, to sort of also break the hegemony of the written text as the dominant modality. So looking at bodies, looking at spaces, relations, experiences. So in my own work, I've been interested to look at some of these non-traditional sites, parliamentary proceedings, pamphlets by political organizations, reports by human rights organizations regarding the violation of prisoner rights, funeral ceremonies, speeches given by militants in prison. These are some of the texts that I've tried to look at. But also the embodied experience of a certain space, like the prison in Turkey, or practices such as going on hunger strike, or even self-immolation. Sort of these extreme practices that are carried out with the body to make a political intervention. And to try to think of something like hunger striking as an appropriate theoretical object is challenging. You can't really find much of a resource in the canon. So it's kind of like you have to go out of the comfort zone and to look at these specific knowledges that are generated by people either who are participating in them, engaged in them, or supporting them, or involved in some particular way, either as family members, doctors, human rights workers, etc. To be able to capture the actual lived experience of such a practice, and to incorporate those voices in protest, to witness and to record these things that vanish because they won't make it into traditional texts. So what I've tried to do in my own work is to combine the insights that I was able to generate through ethnographic work, through interviews, and immersion in the site, these very concrete, sort of specific knowledges, to put this in conversation with the more traditional thinkers in the canon or in contemporary theory. So to take these practices seriously and to study them and to try to formulate them, what they're doing theoretically, in a way that is sort of on par, or that can be put on par with someone like Hobbes or Marx or Foucault or Agamben or Membe. So in my mind, this is an attempt to try to write the history of the present in a more egalitarian way, a history from below, or history of the present from below, so to speak. And in this, the idea of a specific case has been very important to me, and in this I've been very much influenced by the late thinking of Louis Althusser, especially his aleatory materialism, where he tries to reorient materialism toward a more capacious philosophical current that allows for contingency rather than just determinism. And he's really, I mean, he's influenced all his career by psychoanalysis, but also history. And he says something that I find very important. He says, in history and psychoanalysis, and I would add in politics too, all that exists is the case. All we have is really singularities and the concrete and the immediate. But this concrete and the immediate has a certain opacity. It's not obvious. Or if it's obvious, you have to be suspicious of ideology. So, so the question then becomes how to theorize from within a certain conjuncture, considering all of its complexities, its contradictions, and its specificities, to look at the singular and to try to distill from that singular generalities or constants that can speak to other singularities in a way that that allows us to tackle issues of greater significance, of broader significance. I dare say universal significance, but in 100 quotation marks. Okay, so thinking about this in a more general term, to sort of try to move back into what I posited as my first attempt, and that's to make a case for political theory, or critical theory in particular. I think it's important to be able to note that on the one hand, there is a general sort of marginalization of political theory subfields in the field of political science, but also, and I briefly mentioned this, there is a kind of path determinacy, if you want, in the sense that critical theory has also chosen for itself a certain direction that has become kind of self-referential. In other words, you know, instead of a study of the world, which, for example, marked the first generation of Frankfurt School thinkers, what we have are, you know, debates about, you know, the normative foundations of critique, the possibility of critique, the practice of critique. So it's more of a commentary on critique rather than its original impulse, which was critiquing the world, or studying the world first, and then critiquing the world. So I think this direction has not been particularly fruitful, and it's very important to be able to reorient critical theory back toward the world. And this is, you know, to follow some of the research programs that have been abandoned by the first generation of the Frankfurt School. But not just, I mean, I don't want to use critical theory simply to denote the Frankfurt School either. I understand it in a more capacious form. I would include Foucault in there and Althusser in there as well. But to go back to issues of the state, so thinking about the state, thinking about capitalism, authoritarianism, and inequality, again, rather than just focusing on what it means to do critique and what it means to, and what enables us, from what position do we speak when we criticize, etc. So this is what I'm interested in doing. This is what I'm trying to do, to build on sort of these canonical texts, but also the very rich tradition of the 20th century, to re-engage the world and to sort of re-establish what from Kant onward has meant sort of critical theorization, and that is to have a theoretical relationship to one's own present, or a critical relationship to one's own present. I think this is important, but I also think it's important in our work on the case, or doing case studies, because it allows us to maintain a distance from pure positivism or empiricism. You know, it's really important to be able to go out to the field and to collect and to, you know, gather and experience and bring those to bear on theoretical questions. But it's as important, in my opinion, to have sort of a critical distance to the narratives that we collect, to have, you know, to be cautious not to take everything at its word about itself. And I think this is something that often falls out of the picture in ethnographic accounts that are informing political theory. It's not just to sort of try to represent the world most accurately, but also to maintain that critical distance that critical theory allows us while we are collecting those narratives. And so really a caution against taking actors that we want to take very seriously, taking them at their word, and to be able to maintain an independent space for theory. Maybe, I mean, I can actually stop here so that we have more time for discussion. This is sort of the main contours of what I wanted to say anyway. But overall, I mean, I hope, I don't know how convincing, but I hope that I at least provide an opening for political theorists to think seriously about going beyond the canon and to experiment in order to do sort of an alternative history of the present. Thank you.
So we have about 4 minutes for questions if you'd like to ask. If you don't have any right now, Professor Barhu will be in C415A. I'll take some of the
Okay.
if like during our breakout
suggestion, I'm sorry to interrupt, but how about if we all present and then there might be time for questions afterwards and get more of a conversation?
Yeah,
Is that
that
okay?
would work perfectly. All right. So then we will move on to Professor Barbara Cruikshank. She is the author of The Will to Empower Democratic Citizens and Other Subjects, and her second book, Machiavellian Optimism, Sustaining the Spirit for Political Life as an Endless Struggle, is forthcoming. Her research and teaching are dedicated to developing theoretical contributions from empirical, ethnographic, and politically engaged research, and she is Associate Professor of Political Theory at University of Massachusetts Amherst.
Thank you. And thanks to Summer for inviting me. And we had a conversation about what I should do, and we came up with the question. We came up with a question: how to design and carry out a research plan for engaged, empirical, archival, historical, or ethnographic research that will make significant theoretical contributions. So I thought this sounded really great, and then I started thinking about it. I thought, what am I going to say? So I thought, I'll go to my grad students and say, what should I say? And they basically said, say what you always say to us. So, okay, so this is going to be very practical, very practical. And I've separated my comments between research design and the actually carrying it out, like how do you actually do this? And so these are some of the things that my graduate students spoke back to me. These are the things you told me that were helpful. So, and the first thing was that research design is a launching pad, and that's all it is. Whether you're writing a grant proposal or a dissertation prospectus or writing out your abstract for a conference paper or whatever, what it's for is to persuade whatever your audience is that you're onto something and that it's worth pursuing. And then you should just let it go, because it disappears. Nobody ever looks at that part of anything. Nobody ever comes back after you spend the money that you've gotten from your grant to say, did you follow this protocol that you laid out in this never happens, right? It's a dead document. And so my recommendation would be to not spend very much time on it. And it's just one of those things, you feel like you're committing yourself to this giant project, and it's so important, and you want to say so many things, and you want to change the world with this, say your dissertation project or whatever, and you create such high stakes that you can't actually finish because no, 15-page document could ever do that. So how do you change your expectations? How do you do this? So the first thing is that know in advance that the theoretical contribution that you plan to make on the basis of whatever research you're doing is extraordinarily unlikely to be the theoretical contribution you actually make. It's not going to happen that way, and it never does. And just to give you an example, when I was writing my dissertation prospectus, I had never read Foucault, and I wrote this thing, and it was about Weber and bureaucracy and feminist theories of empowerment. And I was doing it because I was a welfare rights activist at the time, and I thought of myself as going out to do what then we called participant observer research, right? Now it's called engaged research. I couldn't explain anything. I was armed with the 3 faces of power, and I was armed with, examples of work that I admired that did, participant observation research and made theoretical contributions, and I just was hitting a brick wall after brick wall. And the worst thing, as it turned out, was that I had ingested this feminist theory of empowerment, and I really realized I was out there looking for empowerment, and I was myself exercising the will to empower. And that was really just thrown in my face by people who were like, what are you? I don't want to be in power, like, get off my back. It was really extraordinary, and I couldn't explain or get at what I wanted to get at with the framework that I had, and luckily I stumbled across, I was in a law library, and I stumbled across this reference to this thing, and it cited Foucault. I was like, oh, but a light went on, and I went off and I read Foucault, and it worked. New other research came out at the time that ended up being really core in importance, and work by Judith Butler that was core and important to the way I ended up doing what I was doing. So everything I had planned was nonsense. And I even got a dissertation grant on the basis of that proposal, right? And I didn't use any paper. So the first thing is that you should expect surprises, right? And in fact, if you go into your empirical or historical or whatever, ethnographic work, whatever you're doing, and you have this analytical framework, or a theoretical framework, and the first thing that you're going to try to do is to find that thing out there. And as a manuscript reviewer, I see tons and tons of manuscripts where basically they go on and on and on for 10 pages saying the same old, like, I'm an editor of a journal called Foucault Studies, so I read a lot of stuff on, like, governmentality. Here's what governmentality, here's what Foucault says. It's like, this is the journal of Foucault Studies. Do you think people really need 10 pages telling them what Foucault said? Like, this has been published and it's like, get on with it. And then they say, I'm in Denmark and I'm working in a mental health clinic, and oh, it's governmentality. Like, so what? Like, if you have that analytical framework, you're going to go out in the world and you're going to find it, and nobody cares, and it doesn't work. So what do you do instead? What does it mean to have an analytical framework if you're not going to go apply it to the world? And so I think Bonnie just mentioned, how much distance you should have from the case or the text that you're looking at, and how much you should let it speak for itself, and how much you should impose an interpretation or a critique on it. And this is something that in the end turns out to be easier than you might think. It's not something you can design in advance, because you're gonna be surprised by the things people say, or the document that you find, or how differently you come to see the material that you're aiming at. So by expecting surprises, I think you can like let a little bit of the weight of having to do everything in this 15-page proposal, it lifts it off your back. It's just a starting point. And if you can convince an audience that you're onto something interesting that's potentially important, that's all you have to do to get the grant or to pass your dissertation proposal or whatever. And then as it adapts along the way, it's only going to get more interesting. And the contribution you're going to make is only going to get more important. So it's just a starting point, it's a launching pad. I've only ever had one graduate student who wrote a dissertation prospectus and actually carried it out, chapter and verse, and in the end, it was a fine dissertation, but in the end she did not have anything that was even remotely publishable as a book. And she had to abandon all but 2 of the chapters, which she then had to add content to. And it was a book on Arendt. And like the world needs another book on Arendt, like we all need a hole in the head, right? And it just was never gonna, it was really great. It was a great dissertation, but it was totally unpublishable. So I don't know if that's, if I should take one example like that and make generalizations about it, probably not, but that told me that it doesn't work to stick to your plan. I just don't think it's gonna work very well if you stick to your plan. And you might have to ditch it along the way. And one of the hardest parts of research design for me is this confounding requirement that you state what your contribution is going to be before you've done the research, right? I'm sure many of you recognize this feeling of like, what? How am I gonna do that? So I've learned, probably the hard way, that the best way to deal with this is to be clear about your target audience or your target audiences. Is it a group of scholars? Is it a body of literature? A group of activists? Is it the powers that be? Is it those you disagree with or agree with about something? And what are you trying to show them? And how will your research make them see things differently? That's your contribution. And so if you think in terms of audience, it's freeing to me. It releases me from, that vexing distinction you have to make in your grant application between your goals and your objectives. What's the, like, how do I figure that out? Especially as a theorist, oh my God, it's mind-boggling to me how you do that. So by being clear about who my target audience is, or audiences are, it frees me up to articulate what my contribution is, and you don't actually have to say exactly what it is.